For some of you, this will be your first lecture, I guess. I'm not doing it as a video conference or as a video recording because I don't think you want to stare at my face for this long. And anyways, you know that I am the Prezi queen. So our goal today is to talk about logical fallacies, something that I have hinted at for a while. And there's 4 different camps. So I'm going to make 4 different videos just to sort of give you a break from my nonstop talking. And I'm also going to post the same Prezi link so you can follow along. And this is going to take the place of most of our lessons this week. I want to make sure that we are absorbing these and that we're able to understand what their definitions are, but also be able to identify them when we hear somebody using one and avoid using them ourselves. So when we talk about logical fallacies, we just mean bad arguments. There's a couple different types, and more often than not, we're able to notice if something is not a great argument. For example, this fine one from Tumblr: lasers were once a huge scientific breakthrough. Now we use them to play with cats. Computers were once a huge scientific breakthrough. Now we use them to look at cats. Conclusion: science is made for cats. This sort of takes me back to logical reasoning a little bit, where we almost see an A plus B equals C, except there's something a little bit off here. Obviously, we could diagnose what's wrong with this argument, which is that we are just comparing these 2 technological scientific breakthroughs, and just because they have this correlation of cats have some association with it, therefore these 2 things, the lasers, computers, scientific breakthroughs, must be made for cats. So obviously not a good argument. I also saw this one yesterday on Twitter, even though it was old, and I just loved it because it had logic in there. Anyways, I love bad arguments. They're really, really fun to try to break down. And it's even more fun when you are versed on logical fallacies so that you can call people out. I think this is probably the most useful part of formalized rhetoric and logic because it makes you, I don't want to say invincible, but certainly much more prepared to take on conversations with family at the dinner table or at the horrible Thanksgiving table where somebody is saying racist things, somebody's saying, bigot things in your family. It's always the uncle, or just even friends or people on Twitter or people on Facebook, if you still use that, being able to engage with them if that's what you're into in a way that's logically sound. So logical fallacies are arguments where the conclusion doesn't follow the premise. So we know from logical reasoning that there's a flow, A plus B equals C. And so in this case, C is just not going to add up from A and B. And there's a couple different types here, but our goal is to be able to identify them in our own research so that we don't use poor argumentation from other people. That's one of the number one things I mark off on people's papers, which is this source doesn't work. And because you've made your house, you've made your paper, you've made your speech, your argument, whatever, using this person's poor argument, now you have this whole wall that almost is like termite riddled, like there's just holes in it. And so your entire house, which is your argument, I'm trying to use an analogy here, is going to crash down. We also want to make sure that we identify them in our opponent's argument so we can straight up attack them and to avoid using them ourselves so that people do not attack us. We are called to be good readers, to be good speakers, to be good writers, and this is one way that we can do so. So there's 2 different camps. This is not important for you to know at all, but I'm just giving some context. There's fallacies of relevance. So that means that you're using evidence that just doesn't make sense in the argument. And there's component fallacies, which is where you have those errors in the A plus B plus C, inductive and deductive reasoning, or those syllogistic terms, which is the same thing as the sort of word problems made with A plus B plus C, and they fail to overlap. So the main things that we're looking for, if we broke it down, are when an opponent is trying to distract you, when there's a lack of information or lack of good information, when the reasoning is just totally disconnected, but often they use distraction to keep you from identifying that there is a break in that logic, or really aggressive pathos, because we know how powerful pathos is. And if you use a lot of it, you can, again, distract somebody from really understanding how your argument is poor. So we're going to look at 4 different areas, and each of these is going to have its own video. And so some of these may be a little bit longer because I do have some YouTube videos in here for us to watch. I'll probably pause some of those or fast forward them because we don't need all of it. So one is the distractions, one is the misconnections, One is the bad ethos, so usually bad evidence, bad authority, and then the mean ones, which I also call usually the racist ones, the ones that are usually a little bit more harmful for people. And so this video, we're just going to cover the first one, which is the distractions. So one of the biggest distractions is just appeal to emotion. I have the Latin in here. There's Latin and Greek. Most of it's Latin. You don't have to know the Latin, just if anybody is a Latin nerd. I have that in here. Latin's really useful if you just can identify some of the root words or the suffixes or prefixes. So anyway, something to do during quarantine if you're into it. So obviously an emotional appeal that when you should be using a logical issue during a debate. And these are the ones that most of us just hate, and we can tell when it happens. Somebody uses a sob story when you're supposed to be giving reasons. So we still see this around something like vaccinations. It's such a loaded issue, and people put the health of their children above maybe what the science is. So even going back into the late 1700s, or not 1700s, excuse me, in the 1800s, early 1900s. I forget exactly which era this is from, but clearly they're using just these scare tactics. A woman holding her child afraid of the snake and the skeleton that's risen from the dead. That's obviously supposed to be vaccinations. We also know it from stuff like this, which I'm not going to have us watch the whole video, but it brings in those questions of, is it effective? Yes. I'm sure you're squirming in your seat right now because no one wants to look at the one-eyed cat, and there's something in this video that I hate. It's like this little kitten that's just screeching. I can't do it, so we're not going to look at that anymore. But is it effective? Yeah, it definitely makes you feel terrible. We've talked a little bit about charity funding before and how it can be a little manipulative. Is it a good argument? Probably not. It gets tricky. So same with something like World Vision. World Visions are a little better than most, but they're pretty guilty of just using pure emotion. Excuse me for a moment. My cat needs to be let out of the room. Here you go. All right, he was let out. We see, I forget where I was saying, but we see a child who doesn't look happy, and the question poses, I can afford to bail out A, and multiple choice, we're invited to answer major bank, auto company, child slave. Of course, we're supposed to feel really, really bad because the government has bailed out major banks and auto companies, but we don't see that kind of effort towards freeing child slaves. However, this breaks down logically because the government are the ones that bail out banks and auto companies. We ourselves don't do this. However, this is trying to get us to pay monthly, to send money to, I don't know if bailout is the right term, but to free child slaves through World Vision. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. That's a good thing. However, if we really just apply logic to this argument, it just doesn't work. But the idea is for you to emotionally just like feel guilt at that, and recognition that we don't put our money maybe where we should. One of my favorites is a red herring. And this is just sort of the classic, like jingling the keys in front of the baby situation where you're trying to divert attention away from original arguments in a distracting way. And so I'm going to show one of the longer videos just because it's such a hot mess and it's really fun to watch. So I wish that we were watching this all together, but here we are.
How did you feel hearing that?
Well, obviously,
she's talking about locker room
offensive.
talk from the 2016
However,
election.
I think it's totally irrelevant. I mean, it was so long ago, and I do believe that most men will talk about women in ways that they would never talk about publicly. And of course, if they would have known that they were being recorded, there's no doubt in my mind the conversation would have been totally different. Nobody is perfect. Here's the issues. Last night in that debate, they defined their issues. They lined the marks in the sand. Number one, Roe v. Wade. Okay, Hillary Clinton doesn't care about murdering babies, dismembering abortions. That's okay with her. Okay?
Wait a second.
Religious freedom.
We're talking. I appreciate you talking about substance, and that is important, Vicky. But we're talking about locker room conversation.
Yes.
My question was about: is it okay that a man who wants to be the president of the free world is bragging and admits to it? And yes, he's apologized.
Yeah. Well,
to
that's
sexual
wrong.
assault.
Okay. Yes, but that is wrong. Absolutely. But here's the thing. He's not running to be the Pope. Look at the culture of our country.
His face right there is my favorite.
Everybody knew he had strip clubs, but still the millions of people chose him to be the nominee. I mean, this is the kind of person that needs to lead our country. God can use anybody. He used the harlots. And that's the thing.
Sean,
it's all about what God can do. God can do this. God can use this man.
But you know, the things that we
It's all a part of it.
From this adult man who is running to be president of the United States, millions of children heard that, boys and girls. And boys may take their cues from this guy who wants to be our president and behave in accordance with...
Okay, but here's the thing. When Bill Clinton was president, my children came home from school and they had no idea it was actually called the Oval Office. They thought it was called the Oral Office because of the talk in the elementary schools. Bill Clinton educated my children at a much younger age than I wanted to.
But Vicky, Bill Clinton isn't running for president right now.
Exactly.
We're talking about Hillary Clinton.
No, but his wife is. His wife is. And they are a pair. The two are one.
Okay. So a lot happened there. And hopefully that gave you a chuckle. So I should have prefaced it. They were talking about the 2016 election, where Trump was caught on tape several years earlier, saying remarks about a woman's body, that if you're a celebrity, if you're famous, you can sort of have whatever woman you want. You can go up and kiss them. You can grab them by the pussy. And then in the debate, when he was confronted about that, saying by definition that's sexual assault, he said, no, it's locker room talk, which is a fascinating shift in reframing we're going to talk about in a second. But obviously she's using a lot of sort of religious language, which there's nothing wrong with that in the first place. She's coming from a religious perspective. However, she's just veering off into all kinds of different areas. And instead of leading these two anchors along, it made them suspect. They were trying to ask, how does the church react to that? Like, what do you think about that? You're a woman, you're a woman of God. What do you think about that kind of language? And it went off into, most spectacularly, abortion, which it wasn't that argument at all. But in many cases, and this is another fallacy we'll get to in a second, if you bring in a really loaded word like that, you might just veer people away. But that didn't necessarily happen. So basically just staying on track is the way that you can be a good arguer and not make a fool of yourself on national television. So either or is an argument that gives only two options, even though there's probably more. But the idea here is that you kind of trap people into responding and not thinking about it. So not seriously, but either you love bacon or you're wrong is a classic example. It's either or. You could see the either or in there. It doesn't give any option for not liking bacon or not being wrong. It's really, really subjective. And so there's a lot that's wrong. I said wrong. A lot that is not logical about setting somebody up into this trap, basically. But anytime, this is kind of blurry, I'm sorry about that. One that's used a lot is if you're not with me, you're my enemy. Either you're for us or against us. That was really, really big during the Iraq War. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. Of course, those are not the only options. That doesn't really leave any room for dissent. So it gets tricky. It gets steamrollery very quickly. Could also happen in a more sinister way when you're collecting data. So if you are giving people options of boxes to click, like this one from several years ago on gun violence, the only two options are yes or no. Yes, the Republican Party should stand up for constitutional rights. Gun ownership is a fundamental freedom. And no, we need to ban guns now and update our outdated Constitution. Republicans should bow down and do what's right. No Republican in their right mind is going to choose that. Even the language is really loaded in there. even calling the Constitution outdated, people are not going to choose that because of its violent language, and it makes the user, the person voting themselves, not look good. So you're really setting this up as like, well, really, you have to choose yes. Begging the question was when an argument is stated in a way that sounds like it must be true, even though there isn't any evidence given. A lot of this is circular reasoning. So the classic example of circular reasoning is God exists because the Bible says God exists because the Bible is the inspired word of God, and that proves that God exists. You're not actually providing any evidence. You're using distracting language to just create, again, this perfect little circle. And there's a lot of arguments you can make for why God exists. There's entire theological schools and people who have multiple PhDs who study apologetics, and they're able to construct arguments. This is not a good argument. This is not an argument for why God exists because it just goes in a circle. So I've been tracking a lot of the language around coronavirus, especially coming from our leaders. And so most of these videos are going to deal with Trump. If you are a Trump supporter, that's fine. I'm not doing this to mock him. It's because he is I was going to say unhinged. That is a loaded word. He's very unfiltered and has a presence since he's not a trained politician. He's going to, I'm trying to be so diplomatic. He messes up more logically because he doesn't have the classical training. So every politician does commit logical fallacies. Everybody does. And you could say that some are more, those who are, for trained politicians are more damaging because it's really insidious and it's very hidden, and therefore a lot more persuasive. You're less likely to recognize something as a rhetorical fallacy. It's just a lot easier with Trump. And so it's been this gift for rhetoric professors because it's just very easy, an easy teachable moment. But this was from a couple days ago, and I'll just let the context speak for itself.
Thank you. Yesterday, Jared Kushner said the notion of the federal stockpile was it's supposed to be our stockpile. It's not
of respirators.
To be state stockpiles that they then use. What did he mean by our?
Oh, what are you asking?
And even the fact that taxpayers from
what's
every
that? I
state
got you.
No, it's not a gotcha.
Our, you know what our means? United States of America. That's what it means. It means
the states.
Our. It means the United States of America. And then we take that our and we distribute it to the states.
So why did you say it's not supposed to be state stockpiles that they then
because we need it for the government and we need it for the federal government. But when the states are in to also keep
giving it to if it's not to the states.
To keep for our country, because the federal government needs it too, not just the states. But out of that, we oftentimes choose, as an example, we have almost 10,000 ventilators, and we are ready to rock with those ventilators. We're going to bring them to various areas of the country that need them. But when he says our, he's talking about our country. He's talking, he's talking about the federal government. I mean, it's such a basic, simple question, and you try and make it.
Okay, that's enough. So that's a logical hot mess. The argument was, Jared Kushner, who we put in charge of the coronavirus task force, I don't know why, was saying that the states were being too greedy, asking for all these respirators. Certain states just do need it more because we do have a national stockpile and there's state stockpiles. However, it was an argumentative mistake that now Trump is having to backtrack on. However, it ends up being this cyclical situation because the respirators, he says, are for the country, the whole country. And then the reporter says, well, who else would it be for if it's not for the states? The states are the country. And he says, no, they're for the federal government and in our country. So they're just going back and forth. And a lot of this has to do with terminology and just not defining your terms. We talked about rhetorical strategies, and this is why definition is super, super important. And this is related to a straw man. So a straw man, as I mentioned a little bit before, is like a red herring, but you're setting up this ridiculous version of somebody's argument, forcing them to distract themselves away by trying to knock down the decoy. So about 2 years ago, this was there's a chemical attack in Syria, and I forget who this dude is, but he said to those disagreeing with our military operation tonight, please offer your alternative strategy for stopping Assad's use of chemical weapons against children, or do you just not care about these innocent victims? So this doesn't really invite people to offer alternative strategies because you added on that little thing about children. Now, if you took this bait, if you took this straw man, you would have to then prove that, oh no, I do care about innocent victims. Let me prove to you that I do. And then you're distracting yourself by covering that argument instead of returning to the original one. So it's a little bit trickier, but the idea is just to put up all these roadblocks so that the person you're arguing with has to dismantle that roadblock and you get ahead by quite a bit. For example,
is that if we are going to make progress on this issue, and I know Hillary Clinton has kind of misstated my view, as a nation, we are going to have to stop shouting at each other, and we're going to have to come together. It means to say that very strong gun control advocates may not get everything they want. And people who think they should have a missile launcher in their backyard as a constitutional right may not have that. All right?
So obviously gun control advocates do not want missile launchers in their backyard. And if this was a debate one-on-one with a gun control anti-support. God, language is so hard when you're not lecturing that often. A gun rights advocate, then they would have to say, no, of course I don't want that. This is what I want. So now you're kind of letting that opponent get the better of you because they've stopped you in your tracks. I'm going to show one more just because this one is kind of tricky, which is from the Colbert Report. And it goes by really, really quickly, but I like this because you can see somebody actually take the bait.
Let's talk about your opponent, Sue Kelly, for a second. Sure. Besides the economy, reproductive rights, taxation, the environment, and education, where do you and Sue Kelly differ?
Well, she voted for this war, which I would not have voted for. She voted for...
So you'd rather see Saddam back in power?
No, but I'd love to see a convincing plan that would show us a way to victory in Iraq.
Stay the course.
I've heard that, and...
Okay, but it didn't sink in?
Well, I think that...
So, the original question was, how do you and your political opponent, differ? And then Colbert caught him when he said he wasn't against this war and said, oh, you want Saddam Hussein back in power, which this was older, but of course nobody wants that. That's ridiculous. And instead of saying that's not what I'm talking about and moving on, he took the bait and said, no, but what I would like to see is, so he took that bait. Equivocation, I know we've discussed. This is probably the most important one, but it's deliberately failing to define your terms or deliberately using words in a different sense than the one the audience will understand. The classic example is in the 90s when Bill Clinton was accused of having sex with his whatever she was, with Monica Lewinsky. He said, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. So sexual relations is an interesting phrase. That's not one that we use that often. I don't think that you guys have your friend brag to you about having sexual relations with somebody and that no, there are a lot of other words for it, but that's very odd. So what he was saying was that I didn't have intercourse, but I did do other stuff. But what people heard, because we're not as familiar with the term sexual relations, the dictionary definition is just sort of sexy stuff in general. Vaguely sexual liaison. So, excuse me. No, it's not. Sorry. It literally just means intercourse. Ugh, excuse me. So he was saying I did not have intercourse with her. But people just heard I didn't do anything sexy at all because we don't really have a solid definition of what sexual relations is. Very, very clever to do because people who were just tuning in to the press conference then heard that soundbite and were like, oh, he's innocent. Okay. And moved on with it. Not everybody's going to say, well, what does that mean? Which I think is a really important part of being a good rhetorician, is understanding that people don't necessarily take the time to unpack things. And so we want to be the kind of students and learners and speakers and writers and professionals individuals who do take the time to say, wait, what does that phrase mean? What were you trying to say? That one doesn't make sense. And equivocation is one that we want to look out for. Of course, going back to locker room talk, I know I've also talked about this before, but fascinating historic moment of equivocation when the CNN anchor said that was dictionary definition, what you said was sexual assault. You were promoting sexual assault. And Trump, in front of a live audience, said, no, it's sexual, it's locker room talk. So redefining it, and it worked. So as much as I don't like the guy, it was I hate to say clever because it has a positive connotation, but it was really effective because you saw that first clip when we looked at red herring. A lot of people wrote it off immediately because locker room talk has these strong connotations of just very pedestrian. Everyone's been in a locker room. It's really neutral. Yeah, maybe you like talk about girls you're into. Maybe you're a little more braggy in the locker room because you're just surrounded by people of the same sex, classically. But most people are not going to say that they've experienced sexual assault or say that that's okay. So a very, very fascinating disengaging of meaning that's really dangerous. This can go for how you redefine terms and reframe terms. So a very infamous interview with Rudy Giuliani saying that like truth is not truth. It's somebody's version of the truth. And the president says that the truth is not truth. So it's really, really, it's fascinating to have somebody say, oh, this word actually doesn't mean this thing at all. What you think is true is actually not true at all. Which is why I'm going to move ahead. I want to bring in doublespeak, which is not a classic rhetorical fallacy, but one that's really related to equivocation because it's saying one thing and meaning another and then linking those two things together. So this comes from the book 1984, which maybe many of you read it in college or in high school, or you're having to read it for a literature class now. Only read it when you're in a good mood because it's kind of a bummer. But the idea is that you have this totalitarian government that is telling people that lies are truth. So the classic example is, 2 + 2 = 5. And you just ingrain that into these people so much that they're going to say, oh yeah, 2 + 2 is 5 because you just get used to it. And the same thing goes when you say you didn't say something. So right now that's happening in the White House. There's a real extensive timeline of stuff that Trump has said about COVID-19, about the spread of coronavirus. It's no secret that the U.S. is number one, but we're number one in deaths from coronavirus and cases. And he's gone on Twitter to say that all of these things he didn't say at all, even though there is a record. And even if the record's presented to him, he says it's not true, or this is where fake news comes into it. So incredibly, incredibly dangerous, very hard to confront because you get this sort of might equals right saying like, cool, that's in front of me. I see that record. I hear my voice, but I didn't say it. Because what do you do with that? If somebody is refusing to say that the sky is blue and you're like, look, just look at it. And they look, they're like, no, what do you do with it? One that I didn't cover, let me go back real quick, is disassociation. So taking two words and creating opposite meanings. So this was done fantastically earlier this year when Michael Cohen, who was Trump's lawyer before he was ousted and convicted, says, I lied, but I'm not a liar. I've done bad things, but I'm not a bad man. You would think that the definition of a liar is someone who's lied. I know that we see that as more of a chronic thing of, a liar is somebody who lies continuously, but it's still taking this meaning and saying, this meaning doesn't apply to me. Yeah, I did this thing, but I also didn't do enough of it to be considered this thing. Trump he behaves kindly, but he is not kind. So it's a really fine line between these terms, and it gets really interesting the way that they can be separated. And this is one of those nuances that's very difficult to tell. So when we come back for our next one, we're going to look at, go back, our misconnections.